So you know when you browse through stacks of models and you see something, inspiration strikes, and then you just have to get it. Well, that's what happened to me when I saw this Star Wars Imperial Trooper on a Dewback, which you see in Star Wars A New Hope. And I just had to buy it. Now this set is part of the Star Wars Legion tabletop game, so I'm going to spend some proper time on this and paint it to the best of my ability, purely for the joy of the love of painting. But for now, what comes in the kit? So, as you can see, it is brand new in the cellophane. Now looking at the back from the picture, the sculpt looks really interesting with a variety of loadouts you can choose from. It also looks to come with the cards and tokens that you need to play the model in the game if you choose. So carefully slicing through the cellophane, I have to say I do love the box art on this, but let's get to the good stuff. Okay, so first out is the tokens and the cards that I just mentioned, which look to be of decent quality. Next is the basic rules for when using the unit in game, as well as a set of instructions which looks fairly simple, though there's no part numbers though. In the next compartment is all the plastic parts in little bags, so I guess the manufacturer saves space in the box and I save time not having to cut all the parts out of the sprues, which makes for a novel change. Okay, so starting with the Dewback itself, the components are all push fit, so in theory it should be fairly simple to put together. But I guess that it will limit the posability. But the detail looks really nice, and it is easy to clear up the few mould lines there are with the flat of a blade of a hobby knife. Now one downside of the push fit system is that it can be difficult to try and dry fit properly and then be able to take it apart again to glue it. Now this means that you can get gaps if it won't go together properly, like between the front and back halves here, but you probably won't be able to easily see that join once it's been painted anyway. Now the head of the Dewback is quite an interesting setup. It will look great once it's together and with a really solid build, a really solid joint. But painting inside that mouth once it's glued together will be near impossible, so I think I'm going to paint that as a sub-assembly. As for the Trooper, it goes together quite nicely, and there is a range of weapon options to choose from. All the bits have shaped joints, so you can't put something on back to front, but that does mean that you'll have to start cutting and pinning if you want to have unique models in the squads. But still, it takes minimal cleanup, and after a few drops of super glue, we are ready to prime. Now, being honest with you, I had to leave this for a few days as I've been busy adulting. It's been a bit crazy outside of YouTube, and it's been really nice to come back and pick up this project again. So first of all, I wanted to be able to see the detail easier. So using the airbrush, I put down a base coat of Tamiya XF17 Sea Blue, then a global zenithal highlight using Tamiya XF55 Deck Tan. Now that has dried, it is looking really nice. But before I put the head together, I'm going to paint the mouth first. Now if you look at photos of large reptiles, they often have a creamy white, so a pale pink mouth. So I'm going to use this as the inspiration for this model. Now painting the teeth in a beige and then going over that with Iron Painter's Speed Paint Sand Golem will help to add definition, add a little bit of shadows and stop them looking too sparkly white. Then just to finish it off, a thick coat of satin varnish to add a more realistic sheen to the tongue. Then it's just a case of gluing the parts together and... oh, come on. Okay. Rookie error. Okay, I got a bit carried away there, and while I knew it would be a tight fit, I forgot to do a proper dry fit, and now I have a massive gap at the neck between the head and the shoulders. It is now glued solid. So that is a point to note if you're building this kit. The push fits are very tight and probably could do with more sanding down. The only way I can now fix this is by breaking out the milliput and the sculpting tools. So after filling the gap, I do my best to continue the skin texture over the whole bit and blend it in to hide that repair. Also, the Dewback has a ridge of hair running down its spine, but on the sculpts it's not particularly pronounced. So as I have some putty left over, I then sculpted some hair using a hobby knife to refine it further. Now don't get me wrong, I love two-part putties like milliputs for sculpting. but one of the reasons I'm not keen on using 2-part putty for filling gaps is that even if you mix up small amounts, you nearly always end up with a load left over, which can go to waste. So rather than waste it, you can shape it into a rock-like shape, let it dry and keep it for another project for a basing material. So in this case, I will quickly press the remaining putty into this rock mould from Woodland Scenics, which I have reviewed recently if you're interested. Okay, let's play with some paint. Now those of you who have been on this journey with me for a while will know that I normally look for real-world examples to use for inspiration and as a painting guide, even for sci-fi subjects like this. So I have been looking at reference photos of large reptiles for this project, and if you can guess what real-world species the prime inspiration is for this model, then let me know down in the comments, then I'll give you a shout out on the next video. Now, as a lot of large reptiles have a pale underbelly, I start this off with a coat of Tamiya Deck Tan, then mixing in a little Vallejo Model A yellow and some white into it to make a really pale yellow to start sketching in the yellow parts of the markings, including the eyelids. Now before I go much further, I think it's time to paint the eyes. As a base colour, I used Vallejo Model Air Fire Red, and then I add a dot of Vallejo Orange Rust for the iris, followed by a smaller dot of black at the front of the eye so that pupils look like they're facing forward and looking where he's going. Then to finish them, a tiny dash of white to add that reflection in the eye. Now doing this was properly fiddly, so on all the detailed work on this model you can safely assume that I'm using these bad boys. Now I love these, and if you have not seen these yet, then I'll put a link to the video looking at these down in the description, along with all the kit and paints I'm using on this project. Okay, for the upper parts of the body, I'm going to make up a custom mix of black, dark olive and chocolate brown. Also, so I can work with it for a bit longer, I'm going to add some Vallejo Retarder Medium to slow that drying process down. Then it's just a case of painting it using a larger brush before switching out to a smaller brush to work around the eyes and the face markings. Now also what I'm trying to do from this stage onwards is try and essentially colour in individual scales to make patterns and the bars of stripes rather than just paint lines, if that makes sense. I'm hoping that this will give it a more realistic look, but we'll see if it's worth the time and effort. Now that base green is down, I slightly thin some of that Tamiya Dark Tan and add that to the patterning. On the real life example, it has pale dots in the darker upper areas forming loose stripes in places, with these fading into a stronger black edged yellowy colour on the darker areas, which is quite interesting. Now this did take a long time to do, so I think it's time for a time lapse. Cue the music. Okay, so that took me absolutely ages, and I'm quite pleased with how it's coming out so far. But it did make me chuckle at the sculpt of the face, particularly the right eye, I think. It does make him look like a very happy little chappy, doesn't it? Winning hearts and minds across the galaxy. Okay, so far I'm fairly happy with it, but I may well go back and do some more work on the skin patterns as we pull the rest of the scheme together. But for now, I want to start work on the leather of the harness, the saddlebags and the sleeping roll. Now I don't want it to all look the same, so I'm going to try and do different types of leather effects on each bit respectively. Okay, for the saddle, I'm going to start with the solid coat of Vallejo Model Colour Chocolate Brown. This bit is nothing special, just doing my best to colour inside the lines and not accidentally splodge it all over the areas I've already painted. Next is a loose wash of Vallejo Model Colour Flat Earth. Now the idea here is to add random variations in colour without completely covering that chocolate brown, but also use it to start to create the appearance of weight and volume. Now the next highlight is a dark sand, which is dry brushed over the whole thing before unifying it with a wash made from diluting down Vallejo Model Colour Smoke, And once that had dried, I then added a second layer of the smoke wash as a shade and to accentuate folds and joints in the leather. To finish off the saddle, I use Vallejo model colour black and add some fine lines to the edges to show nicks and cuts, with a final light wash of 50-50 black to water to create the deepest shadows. But I'm not going to go overboard with this wear and tear here. This is an Imperial Stormtrooper after all, with the resources of the Empire behind him as he moves from patrol base to patrol base, so his kit won't be looking threadbare and in poor order. For the reins, I want to use a more contrasting colour, so I'm going to make a mix of about 70% Vallejo model colour wood grain and about 30% orange brown to apply as a base coat. Then I apply the random colour variation, similar how I did it with the saddle dry brush, stippling orange brown. Now, dry brushing is a great technique to have in your toolbox. Basically, it's all about having a minimal amount of paint on the brush, so when you pass the brush over a surface, only a tiny amount of paint is applied, normally to raise surfaces. So it can be a great technique for picking out detail or adding texture. Now, some people say that you should not remove the excess paint on a paper towel, for example, as it can make the paint too dry and it can result in a dusty texture. And supposedly you can get tiny fibres of paper stuck to your model. Other people say to use a non-porous surface to work the paint into the bristles. Likewise, other people recommend using a texture pad. All I can say is that the other options don't really work for me, and I prefer using a paper towel as that works for me. So have a play, find what works for you, and then run with it. So using the paper kitchen towel to remove excess paint, I'm going to stipple on the second highlight colour, which in this case is dark sand. Now next I want to unify those colours a bit, and for this more reddy coloured leather, then I'm going to use a wash of wood grain, before finally adding the light nicks and deep shadows using the black. Then for the sleep roll behind the saddle, I use the same technique and recipe except for swapping out the colours for 50-50 dark sand and Japanese uniform for the base coat, then highlights using dark sand and then flat earth, unifying it with a wash of Vallejo smoke. Then with a final highlight of dark sand. Now, for the Stormtrooper, this is going to be an interesting challenge, because whites, especially smooth, shiny whites, ironically, when it's dirty, is notoriously tricky to pull off, especially on a subject as tiny as this. So I did use some of the spare parts in the kit to make a little paint mule and try out some options to see what I liked. And I tried slap chop, which for me, for something this size and this particular model, didn't look right. So I stripped the paint off of that and tried traditional acrylic wet blending, which also I couldn't get to look right. I think I tried about 3 or 4 different techniques and approaches before I remembered a technique I've used with painting much larger scale busts. So I gave that a go. So first I need to paint all of the black areas using Vallejo model colour black, and at this point I don't need to be too neat. Also, before I get too carried away, I need to do something with this shock prod, the lance that he's carrying. Now I've tried to straighten out the slightly warped plastic to no avail, so I'm going to have to replace it. So after a quick search through some drawers of stuff which might be useful in a project one day, I found some stiff wire which is the right diameter and cut it to length, and got it straightened out by whacking it with a hammer. Then it's just a case of drilling through the fist into the bits that go on either end and then stick it all together, before giving it a quick blast with some Tamiya surface primer. Okay, for the white armour I'm going to use a mix of oil paints from Winsor and Newton and thin those down to a usable consistency with some clean spirit. As this is going to be really fiddly, I'm going to use a few different brushes. Now first is a number 2 and a number 10 from Rosemary & Co.'s Series 33 range. And they are great for acrylics, for oils, for enamels, watercolours, you name it. You just need to give them a good clean and look after them, and these brushes have lasted me for a good few years. So if you want to check these out for yourself, then I'll put a link down in the description. I'm also going to use an old number 10 Dala Rowney brush, which has been completely trashed, but will be ideal for this job. So on my very high-end and expensive paint palette made out of a piece of greaseproof paper, I mix a gradient of ivory black and titanium white with a little yellow ochre to help represent that sandy film over the armour, as well as slightly reflecting the warm desert colours around the trooper. So starting at the darker end of the gradient, which I have thinned down with Clean Spirit, I put a small amount on the surface and then blend that in with the old brush, also slightly dampened with Clean Spirit. Then slowly working my way down that gradient to add lighter and lighter colours, blending them in up to a highlight. Also, I'm trying to use the colour to build the shapes, the volumes, the reflections and the highlights. I guess in a way it's along the same principles as a non-metallic metal style. Now, as the oils are very, very thin layers, they will dry comparatively quickly. They still have more than enough working time to make this process great fun. The helmets is a lot more difficult and more tricky to get right than the flatter pieces of armour. But the long working time you have with the oils gives me plenty of time to go back and forth until I'm relatively happy with it. Now, as I paint this, yes, the detail looks good, but something isn't quite right.
Too little short for a stormtrooper?
Huh? Yeah, that's probably it. Now, it seems that the arms and especially the legs are not quite long enough and maybe a little bit stocky, but that's being really picky. Now, one thing I did learn whilst doing this technique on this model is that smudging the paint in to blend it on such a tiny figure can make the edges less well defined, which can make it look a bit messy. But what I did find that works really well is to thin that oil paint right down and basically do like an edge highlighting technique to define the edge. Then for the pauldron, I'm going to use AK Interactive's Red Brown with a highlight of Vallejo Model Air Red. Then to finish, I add in the details on the helmets with some very thin down ivy black oil paint. So I appreciate this model is designed as a tabletop gaming piece rather than designed as a studio quality display model, but the detail on this thing is pretty good. The only slightly downside is a slightly stumpy stormtrooper, but that is being really picky. And yes, the slightly too tight push fit caught me out a couple of times, and maybe the pose is not quite as dynamic as the box art, but as a project it is pretty simple to put together. And if you enjoyed watching this project come together as even half as much as I enjoyed painting it, then I'm happy, because this was so much fun to do. Now, if you are wanting to use this on the tabletop, then all you need now to do is just base it and you're good to go. However, I've had an idea to take this project a little bit further. And once I've done that, I will put a link up here for you. But whilst I'm working on that, you might want to check out one of these videos right here. And I will see you on the next project.